Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev will kick off what some in the news media are calling the Saltwater Summit in the waters off of Malta. Coming up next, we'll continue our focus on the upcoming summit with an interview with Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger.
Lawrence Eagleburger, Deputy Secretary of State, what's the goal of the United States going into the upcoming summit between George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev?
Principal goal, President's principal goal is to get a better sense of what's in Gorbachev's head, how he thinks about the world, how he thinks about his own situation in the Soviet Union, and how he thinks about other issues, and to give the General Secretary a sense of what is in the President's head and what he thinks about these questions. It is, in essence, then, a question of how can the two better understand each other as they are going to have to deal with each other in the years to come. I think that's the principal objective.
Has the objective changed from when the summit was first scheduled? And I'm thinking of all the changes, the rapid changes in Eastern Europe.
No, I don't think the objective has changed. Obviously, the context in which they have to do their discussions has changed because of the speed at which things are changing in Eastern Europe. But the objective is the same one I think the President's had all along. And if you will recall, the President even has made it clear that when he was campaigning and in the early days of his administration, he did not think this kind of a meeting was in fact a wise idea. He wanted a structured agenda in which people were fairly clear of what was going to be discussed and how it was going to be discussed and what the outcome might be. And I think what he saw after he became president was that in fact, given the situation in the world today, and indeed how things are changing, that he had to look at this a little bit differently. And that's, I think, when he came to this idea of a Malta meeting, and the President has said it was the process of changing his own mind on how to first meet with Mr. Gorbachev.
Does that mean then that this summit doesn't have an agenda, much like the Reykjavik meeting did not have an agenda?
Well, first place, it's not a summit, but it's a non-summit summit, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we and the Soviets have a general idea of what each one of us is going to want to talk about. But there is no formal agenda in which, well, we'll talk about this subject for now, and then 10 minutes later we'll talk about that one. So there is no formal agenda, and if you want to compare it in that sense to Reykjavik, I suppose you can. I think the outcome's likely to be substantially different, but there is some similarity between the two.
Reykjavik has become something of a flag or a warning or a phrase that points out the dangers of an agendaless, if not a summit, then a meeting of the superpowers. How is it that Malta will not present the same risks?
Well, first of all, because at least I'm totally confident that President Bush knows what he's walking into. He has made it as clear as it is possible to make it publicly that he does not intend to come out of this meeting with a lot of agreements, that it is for the purpose of getting to know how the other man thinks and give the other man a chance to learn how he thinks. I'm perfectly confident that that's in fact the way George Bush will play it. There's another point too. In the Reykjavik meeting, Mr. Gorbachev tried to play some games. Now, I suppose it's possible he will again at the Malta summit, but, excuse me, I've now said the word myself, at the Malta meeting, but I think it is less likely because it is now so much more clear that Mr. Gorbachev needs the understanding of the U.S. as he deals with his own internal and external problems, and I suspect he will be, if I can use the term, better behaved than he was at Reykjavik.
We've also heard the suggestion that the President and Mr. Gorbachev might talk about how the United States might respond if Mr. Gorbachev feels he has to crack down on some of the uprisings within his own country. Perhaps that he might even be seeking something called a forbearance from the United States, if he has to do that.
He may well raise that. Again, I can't predict it, but it's a possibility. And if he raises it, the President will hear him out. I'm, again, absolutely confident that President Bush is not going to Malta to work out some form of condominium in Eastern Europe or some form of arrangement where the U.S. and the Soviet Union will work together to manage reform in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe, for that matter. But how the President would answer the question if it's put to him by Mr. Gorbachev, I'd have to leave to the President. But I cannot but believe that the Soviets would know that if they had to use force, in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, there would be a strenuous reaction in this country and in the Western world, and I'm sure the President will tell him that.
In terms of the condominiumization of Europe coming out of this, it brings to mind the phrase that I've heard, I think, from Soviet spokespersons, Yalta on the Malta. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, Yalta was one thing, Malta is another, and we don't intend to play that game.
Why is this held on a boat?
I suppose because they would get wet if they did it without the boat. You know, they've just found a place where they can meet together. Facilities in Malta are they're not huge. It's an island after all, and the boats provide an opportunity for the two to visit each other's territory, if you will, at the same time to use Malta as the base for the support crews and support staff and things of that sort. I do not think it is a major question. It was a convenient place to meet.
Doesn't it also restrict actually the amount of press access, for example, or opportunities for either one of the parties to stage some kind of human interest story that will attract the media?
May I say that only someone from the media would think of that question. It may well be true that that is what the consequence is. I'm absolutely certain that is not the reason they picked boats, but it may make some difference in terms of what coverage they can get.
Who chose Malta?
This was, as far as I know, this was a back and forth between the two sides and was mutually agreed upon. Gorbachev was going to be in Italy in the first place, and it provided a place where the two could meet on more or less neutral ground with the ships of the two countries that they could visit back and forth on.
Let's go back to the distinction between a summit and a meeting. Why don't you spell that out?
Well, a summit, in the terms, at least in the definition that I'm using and that is normally used, goes back to an earlier point you made. There is a set agenda which has been agreed upon before they meet. There have been a lot of working groups that have gone through a number of the items that will be discussed and moved those as close to agreement and resolution as can be made before they go to the chief of state. It's a very formal process with an expectation that there will be formal agreements reached by the two at the summit, which will be announced at the close of the summit. This meeting, in the President's mind, from the beginning, has been a meeting where you sit down and talk to Mr. Gorbachev and try to get a better sense of him, and he tries to get a better sense of you, and where you talk about the issues that face the two countries. And clearly, what's going on in Eastern Europe, you know, with the dynamic of that process, is the kind of issue that they can talk about without arriving at conclusions or agreements on. But the difference is in the formality of the process and in the objective, which in the case of this meeting is to get into each other's heads and to understand each other better.
Are there any issues that are off limits?
I don't know. I hadn't even thought about that question. If one side or the other, and clearly it wouldn't be the President, were to suggest some sort of condominium approach to dealing with the developments in Europe, clearly from our point of view that would be off limits. But off limits assumes that there's been some agreement that issue A, B, or C won't be raised at all, and I am not aware of any such discussions or arrangements. Anybody can bring up anything, I suspect. It will then be up to the other side to say, look, that's just an issue I don't want to talk about, or it's not an issue that's worth spending time on.
Well, let me ask it a different way. Is there any issue that is politically off limits that neither party wants to get into?
Again, my answer would basically be the same. I can't offhand think of any, and again, to the best of my knowledge, at least no prior agreement that certain issues would be excluded from the discussion.
Why don't you talk for a moment about your view of the current state of affairs between the two superpowers as the two men prepare to meet?
Clearly a more relaxed atmosphere between us than has been true for some period of time. Probably best said, more relaxed atmosphere than at any time from the end of from the beginning of the Cold War on.
How does China relate to all of that?
It's obviously important both to Moscow and Washington, and I suspect it would be a subject of discussion between the two in Malta. But in terms of the way you asked the question, how does it relate, I suspect it will not figure large on either leader's agenda in terms of trying to talk to the Soviets or they to us about the future of China or its relationship to the U.S. or to the Soviet Union, in part because China is now going through its own sort of agonizing reappraisal of where it is and where it wants to go, and is therefore somewhat withdrawn from the world scene, and secondly because, at the moment at least, I don't think it figures large on the agenda between the two of us.
Do our NATO allies have any cause for nervousness as Malta approaches?
No, none at all. That doesn't mean they won't be nervous, but they don't have any reason for it. The President has been very careful to keep the allies informed. They know in, I think, large measure what we intend to talk about. You can't predict what the Soviets will raise. And the President is, after all, going to Brussels when he finishes in Malta to brief the Allies. I don't think they have any reason to be nervous. And in fact, what they ought to be is they ought to be optimistic, because it is, after all, a meeting between the two heads of government, and it is something that the Allies have been telling us for months we ought to be doing anyway.
What things has the State Department been doing by way of preparing or briefing the NATO allies prior to the meeting in Malta?
Well, there have been conversations with a number of the, well, for example, President Bush met with Mrs. Thatcher last weekend, and there were discussions on the whole question of Malta. There have been consultations back and forth with most, if not all, of the NATO allies. There have been discussions in the NATO Council. And there will be, as I say, a substantial follow-up when, by the President himself when they finish. They have been kept, I would argue, fully informed of the kinds of things we're thinking about talking about.